How many warnings does it take to save a man's life? Nobukazu Kuriki received hundreds from doctors, family, fellow climbers. Everest had already taken 9 of his fingers. On his 8th attempt, it took everything else. Nobukazu Kuriki was not supposed to be a mountaineer. Born in 1982 in Hokkaido, Japan's northernmost island, he grew up in a world of snow and cold, but his early life showed no signs of the obsession that would eventually consume him. He was quiet, methodical, the kind of person who approached challenges with careful planning rather than reckless ambition. His introduction to climbing came through hiking in Japan's northern mountains. What started as weekend excursions gradually evolved into something more serious. Kuriki discovered that he possessed an unusual tolerance for discomfort. Cold that would drive other hikers to shelter barely seemed to affect him. By his early 20s, Kuriki had progressed to technical climbing. He gravitated toward the most challenging routes, but it wasn't the difficulty that drew him, it was the solitude. While other climbers formed teams, Kuriki preferred to climb alone. Solo climbing is inherently more dangerous. No one to catch you if you fall, no one to help if injured. Most climbers use solo climbing sparingly. For Kuriki, solo climbing became his preferred method. In 2009, at age 27, Kuriki made his first attempt on Mount Everest. What was unusual was his approach. He climbed solo, without supplemental oxygen, carrying minimal gear. The decision to climb without oxygen wasn't just about proving his toughness, it was philosophical. Kuriki believed that using bottled oxygen was cheating, that it created an artificial environment. He wanted to climb Everest as it had been climbed by the early pioneers. The 2009 attempt failed, but failure on Everest is common. Most climbers who don't summit on their first try either give up or wait years before returning. Kuriki waited months. His second attempt came in 2010, followed by his third in 2011. Each time he climbed alone, each time without oxygen, each time pushing higher than before. Other climbers began to notice the quiet Japanese man who kept returning to the mountain that had rejected him repeatedly. What they didn't understand was that rejection only made Kuriki more determined. Where others saw failure, he saw data. Each attempt taught him something new about the mountain, about his own limits, about the thin line between survival and death at 29,000 feet. Between attempts, Kuriki would spend months analyzing what had gone wrong. He studied weather patterns, refined his equipment, and trained his body to function in the oxygen-starved environment of extreme altitude. By 2012, Kuriki had spent 3 years studying Everest, like a scientist studies a specimen. His 4th attempt began in May 2012 with methodical preparation. This time felt different. This time, he was confident he could reach the summit. But Everest had been studying him too. On his 2012 attempt, Kuriki was climbing strongly when the weather turned with sudden violence. What had been manageable conditions became a nightmare of wind and snow. Visibility dropped to 0, temperatures plummeted, and the mountain became a death trap. Most experienced climbers would have turned back immediately, but Kuriki had been turned back by weather before, and he was determined not to let it happen again. He pressed on into conditions that should have killed him. Caught high on the mountain, he made a decision that would change his life forever. Rather than attempt a dangerous descent in 0 visibility, he dug a snow cave and waited for the weather to clear. For 2 days and nights, Kuriki huddled in his makeshift shelter at over 8,000 meters above sea level. The temperature outside dropped to minus 20 degrees Celsius. He had limited food, no stove to melt snow for water, and no way to communicate with the outside world. His hands, which he needed to keep exposed to manage his equipment, began to freeze solid. The extreme cold was literally killing the tissue in his fingers, cell by cell. When the weather finally cleared, Kuriki emerged from his snow cave alive, but forever changed. His hands were black with frostbite, the tissue already dying. He could barely grip his ice axes, could barely feel his fingers at all. The descent was agony. Every step down the mountain was a battle against pain and exhaustion. His hands were useless, forcing him to rely on his arms and shoulders. Several times he nearly fell when his damaged hands couldn't maintain their hold. When he finally reached base camp, other climbers took one look at his hands and knew immediately that his climbing career was over. They were wrong about his career, but they were right about his hands. At the hospital in Kathmandu, doctors delivered the verdict. 9 of his 10 fingers would have to be amputated. The frostbite had destroyed the tissue beyond repair. He would keep only his left thumb. As Kuriki lay in his hospital bed, staring at the bandages where his fingers used to be, most people expected him to accept reality. He had given Everest everything he could give. The mountain had taken 9 fingers in return. But as he would soon prove, some obsessions run deeper than flesh and bone. The warnings began before Kuriki even left the hospital in Kathmandu. Medical professionals were clear in their assessment. Climbing at extreme altitude with such severe hand injuries would be extremely dangerous, potentially fatal. Without proper grip strength and the ability to feel temperature changes, he would be at enormous risk of further frostbite or falls. The medical reality was stark. Kuriki had lost not just his fingers, but also much of the nerve function in his remaining hand. This meant he couldn't feel pain, temperature, or pressure the way a normal person could. In the extreme cold of high-altitude climbing, these sensations serve as crucial early warning systems. Without them, he could suffer severe frostbite without even realizing it was happening. It was the first of hundreds of warnings Kuriki would receive over the next 6 years. He listened politely, nodded at the appropriate moments, and ignored every word. Back in Japan, his family was devastated. They had watched his obsession with Everest grow from a healthy passion into something darker and more consuming. Now, seeing him struggle with basic tasks using only his remaining thumb, they begged him to find a new dream, a safer pursuit that wouldn't cost him any more pieces of himself. His mother was particularly distraught. She had supported his climbing for years, understanding that it gave him purpose and joy. But watching him try to eat with chopsticks using only his thumb and palm, seeing him struggle to button his shirt or tie his shoes, she couldn't understand why he would even consider returning to the mountain that had already taken so much. The climbing community in Japan was equally concerned. Fellow mountaineer Ken Noguchi, who had summited Everest multiple times and was respected throughout the climbing world, later expressed serious doubts about Kuriki's realistic chances of success given his physical limitations. The consensus among experienced climbers was clear. Attempting Everest without proper hand function was extraordinarily dangerous. Other climbers who had suffered similar injuries had retired from the sport entirely. The loss of fingers wasn't just about grip strength. It affected balance, the ability to use equipment properly, and most critically, the ability to feel when something was going wrong before it became life-threatening. But Kuriki wasn't just ignoring the warnings. He was actively planning his return. Within months of losing his fingers, he was designing custom equipment that would allow him to climb with his limited grip. He worked with manufacturers to create specialized ice axes and climbing tools that could be operated with a thumb and palm. The modifications were ingenious and showed Kuriki's determination to overcome his disability. He developed strapping systems that would secure tools to his hands, modified grips that could be operated with limited dexterity, and techniques for managing ropes and equipment with his remaining thumb. But the custom equipment couldn't address the fundamental problem. Kuriki's hands could no longer feel the early warning signs of frostbite. The nerve damage from his 2012 ordeal meant that his remaining hand could freeze solid without him realizing it until it was too late. He was essentially climbing blind, unable to feel one of the mountain's most dangerous threats. The warnings weren't just coming from doctors and family. Fellow climbers who encountered Kuriki during his training climbs were deeply concerned by what they saw. His technique had adapted remarkably to his disability, but the fundamental risks remained enormous. One climber who trained with Kuriki described watching him grip his ice axe so tightly that his knuckles went white because he couldn't feel whether he had a secure hold or not. He was overcompensating for his lack of sensation by using brute force, which worked on easier terrain but would be exhausting and potentially dangerous on Everest's technical sections. Despite the chorus of concern, Kuriki announced his return to Everest in 2013. The climbing community was divided between those who admired his determination and those who thought he was being dangerously reckless. Some saw him as an inspiration, proof that disability couldn't stop a determined climber. Others saw him as a man whose judgment had been compromised by obsession. His 5th attempt in 2013 ended in failure when bad weather forced him to turn back. The attempt showed that his modified equipment worked, but it also revealed the limitations of climbing with such severe hand injuries. He moved more slowly than before, tired more quickly, and had to be extremely careful with every movement. His 6th attempt in 2015 also ended in failure, this time when he became ill at high altitude and was forced to descend. Each failure brought renewed pleas from family and doctors. His family's pleas became more desperate. Medical professionals became more insistent. But with each failure, Kuriki's determination only grew stronger. He began to speak about Everest in terms that worried those closest to him. The mountain wasn't just a climbing objective anymore. It had become a personal adversary that had humiliated him, taken his fingers, and needed to be conquered at any cost. Friends noticed that his relationship with Everest had become unhealthy. He would talk about the mountain as if it were a living entity that owed him something, as if the fingers he had lost were a down payment on a summit that he was entitled to claim. His 7th attempt in 2016 came closer to success than any previous effort. He reached within 700 meters of the summit before being forced to turn back by severe weather. For most climbers, getting that close would have been satisfying, proof that the summit was achievable. For Kuriki, it was torture. He had been so close he could almost touch his dream, only to have it snatched away again. The near miss only intensified his obsession. He became convinced that the next attempt would be successful, that he had learned enough from his failures to finally overcome the mountain that had defined his life for nearly a decade. By 2017, the warnings had taken on a desperate tone. His family had essentially staged an intervention, gathering friends, medical professionals, and fellow climbers to convince him to abandon his Everest dreams. The meeting was emotional and lasted for hours, with person after person explaining why another attempt would likely kill him. Those who cared about him had explained the medical risks, the technical challenges, the statistical improbability of success. They had appealed to his love for his family, his responsibility to those who cared about him, his own sense of self-preservation. They pointed out that he had already achieved more than most climbers ever would, that he had nothing left to prove. None of it mattered. Kuriki had made his choice years earlier, in a hospital bed in Kathmandu, staring at the bandages where his fingers used to be. He would return to Everest, and he would keep returning until the mountain gave him what he wanted, or took everything he had left to give. The people who loved him watched as he prepared for his 2018 attempt, knowing that their warnings had fallen on deaf ears. They had done everything they could to save him from himself. But Kuriki carried with him the unshakable belief that this time would be different. The mountain was waiting for him, patient and eternal, ready to collect what it was owed. March 2018. Nobukazu Kuriki arrived in Nepal for what would be his final journey to Everest. At 35, he looked older than his years. The repeated exposure to extreme altitude had taken its toll, but his eyes still held the same determined fire that had driven him through 7 failed attempts. Among the hundreds of climbers converging on base camp, Kuriki was something of a celebrity, the Japanese climber who had lost 9 fingers but refused to quit. Some sought him out to offer encouragement, others to express concerns about his safety. From the beginning, this attempt felt different. There was an urgency to his movements, a sense that time was running out. His body had been pushed to its limits repeatedly over 9 years, and those limits were becoming harder to ignore. The first warning sign came early. Kuriki developed a persistent cough that he couldn't shake, along with other signs of illness that concerned fellow climbers. His recovery between training climbs was taking longer than usual, and he seemed more fatigued than in previous years. When other climbers expressed concern about his health, he dismissed them with polite deflection. He had come too far to let a minor illness derail his 8th attempt. The weather window was limited, and he couldn't afford to waste time recovering from what he insisted was just a minor cold. On May 12, 2018, Kuriki began his final ascent. The weather window looked promising, and he moved up the mountain with the efficiency born of 8 previous attempts. His modified equipment worked smoothly, and his technique had been refined through years of practice. Initially, his progress seemed strong. His radio calls to base camp were positive, reporting steady progress and good conditions. But as he gained altitude, something began to change. The cough that had plagued him at base camp was getting worse in the thin air. His voice over the radio became more strained, his breathing more labored. By the time he reached Camp 1 at 6,065 meters, his condition was visibly deteriorating. Other climbers noticed that he looked unwell. His face was flushed with fever, and he was moving more slowly than usual. His cough had become almost constant, and he was having difficulty eating and sleeping. Several experienced climbers approached him, suggesting that he descend and wait for better conditions. They pointed out that attempting to climb higher while ill was extremely dangerous, that the combination of altitude and sickness could quickly become life-threatening. But Kuriki refused to consider retreat. He had waited a full year for this attempt, had invested enormous amounts of time and money in his preparation. The weather window was perfect, and he was convinced that this was his best chance to finally reach the summit. His determination was admirable, but it was also dangerous. At high altitude, the body's ability to fight off illness is severely compromised. What might be a minor illness at sea level can become life-threatening above 6,000 meters. On May 17th, Kuriki made his push toward Camp 2 at 6,400 meters. The weather was deteriorating, with high winds and blowing snow making conditions dangerous. Most other climbers had decided to wait, but Kuriki pressed on alone. His illness was slowing him down significantly, and the deteriorating weather made progress even more difficult. He was coughing constantly now, and his breathing was labored even by high-altitude standards. He managed to reach Camp 2, but it was clear to everyone there that he was in serious trouble. His condition had deteriorated dramatically during the climb, and he was showing signs of both altitude sickness and severe respiratory illness. Other climbers at Camp 2 urged him to descend immediately, pointing out that his symptoms were getting worse, not better. But Kuriki was beyond rational decision-making. The combination of altitude, illness, and years of obsession had clouded his judgment. On May 19th, Kuriki attempted to continue higher, but his body finally reached its breaking point. He managed only a short distance before being forced to turn around, his condition deteriorating rapidly. On May 20th, 2018, other climbers found Nobukazu Kuriki collapsed near Camp 2. He was still alive, but barely conscious, his breathing labored, his body shutting down from a combination of hypothermia, altitude sickness, and respiratory failure. Fellow climbers immediately began trying to help him, but there was little they could do at that altitude with limited medical resources. Despite their efforts, Kuriki slipped into unconsciousness and died on the mountain that had defined his life for 9 years. Kuriki died, as he had lived for the past 9 years, alone on Everest, still reaching for a summit that remained forever out of his grasp. The news sent shockwaves through the climbing community. His family in Japan was left to mourn the man who had chosen the mountain over everything else, including his own life. Everest had finally claimed what it had been owed since 2012. The mountain that had taken 9 fingers had collected the rest of the debt, with interest. In the end, the hundreds of warnings had been right. They just hadn't been enough to overcome an obsession that ran deeper than reason, stronger than fear, and more powerful than the instinct for self-preservation.